All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to break down Pluribus, and we're going to start with the first episode. One of the things that I've noticed some people saying so far is like, what is this show about? Basically, right? Um, this is not a show that you're going to understand based off of a grand theory. I think that's what people are trying to do. They're trying to come up with some grand theory about what the show's about. That's not, I definitely don't think that's what's intended here. And Vince Gilligan is way too smart of a person to provide something like that. I think this is a very deep and condensed text, or rich text that needs to be understood on many levels. And so that's kind of what we're going to do here. One of the things I think we have to understand about understanding the story is there's many different elements to it. There's there's different levels. And so the most basic level is the story or the plot. What's happening with these characters. That's probably what we'll do a little bit. I don't think that's going to be much of it. On top of that, you have, or maybe you would say under that, you have psychological. And so that's one of the main points we're going to focus on is psychologically what is happening with these characters and psychologically what is taking place in this show. Below that, you also have the philosophical. And so that's another layer that we definitely have to address and break down and understand what is the central philosophy behind this show, or some of the central philosophies they're trying to expound on. And then at the end, I think there's also commentaries, which could be on anything. And I think I'm going to try to do my best to find where the showmakers are commenting on specifically different parts of current society. And so that's a hidden layer, but I don't think it's as important as the psychological or the philosophical, but it's still very relevant. And I also think we have to distinguish between commentary on social events as opposed to what this show is more deeply about, which is the philosophical and psychological aspects of it. So let's get into it. So one of the things I want to point out first is the similarities between the word pluribus and Plotinus. So I don't know how many people are familiar with Plotinus, the philosopher, but he came up with some pretty amazing ideas. He was definitely influenced by Plato, but Plotinus essentially believed in this idea of the one, and the one is central to his philosophy. What is the one? We don't really know. One of the things we do know is that what comes from the one, and the one is essentially everything, are emanations. And emanations are the manifestations basically of the one. And that's you could sort of sum up Plotinus's philosophy to that, the one and the many, the one and the emanations. But you hear what I say right there, the one and the many. Well, that brings up the term pluribus, because pluribus essentially means what? Well, it means many or from many. And this is often associated with the term e pluribus unum, which is associated with the United States and sort of our history in the United States. I say our because I'm from United States, I'm American. And what it's saying is out of the many is one. And so that's a political ideology that's formulated. But some people would say that that's not where it started. And actually, some of this talk started with Plotinus, because he had an idea that said, or talked about the one and the many, and how the many are emanations of the one. I think that's something to keep in mind as we go. The other thing is interesting is the parallels between those two words, pluribus and Plotinus. They're the same amount of letters. The syllables are pretty much in the same place. They kind of like mirror each other a little bit. So that's something I would definitely pay attention to. So we're in the first scene, and what do we see? Well, it's a sky. right? A sky that's going to come back a little bit later. And it's going to, that's where things are going to come from, essentially. I think we're going to find in at least this first episode that the sky and the what is above will bring what is destined to be brought, essentially. And so that's where we start the show. And so then when you see a timer, and the timer is counting down, and it's indicating that something is, we're counting down to something. Something's coming. We don't know what it is, but we're not counting up, we're counting down to when an event is going to take place. So there's some premonition that an event is going to take place, right? So we see two scientists. One of them drives up really quick. He's very excited, obviously, and they're talking in very excited language. Like they've made some type of discovery. We don't know what it is. And so I'm not going to really focus on the science because I don't know what the science is. I'm going to try to help us understand what they're telling us through the visual medium. And like these guys are super stoked because they found something very important, and they're gonna look a little deeper into it, right? So they start talking about some type of life form that is performing regular intervals of something that they're doing, and they use the word drifting, which seems like whatever it is, it's having fun, is enjoying itself. We don't really know what it is, but it seems like it's having fun, and it's doing this regularly, and it's like a code, right? These guys they're astonished. They don't know what to say. They say it can't be. Like, what are they referencing? Something supernatural, obviously, something that is beyond their comprehension. So this is a very important part because they're trying to rationally explain what they're seeing, right? They're trying to blame it on anything that could be logically understood. And they finally come to a point where they say, what is it? And so you have this team of scientists, and what do? They turn to the guy with the glasses and the sweater. So what are we finding? He's the one that would know. He's the expert. He's the one, he's a top guy, right? That's crucial information because he's going to play a big part in what's about to happen, and all he can do is laugh. He's giddy, right? He's like, this is, I don't know, but it doesn't make him fearful at all, right? It makes him happy. He's excited about this. So they talk about trying to crack this code, and the code that they've found is coming is in quaternary. I don't know what quaternary means, but it's something having to do with fours. And I'm just gonna kind of go on a little segue here, but if anybody's ever read Carl Jung, you would find that he had an obsession with four. He believed that four was the number of completeness and wholeness, and that four was reigned supreme above all other numbers. Maybe not above one, but it was pretty important. And one of the things that he would often reference is something called the axiom of Maria. And so the axiom of Maria is a alchemical saying. And basically what it says is one becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth. So we have a reference to the one again with this axiom, but also about the fourth. And there's a connection between the fourth and the one, and that the one comes from the fourth. And so in Carl Jung's studies, he was saying that this is a four, or wholeness that comes from four, is something that represents the individuation process, which is central to all of his teachings. And that was the goal of life, was individuation. And so this is another thing to keep in mind, because we're going to find in a few minutes again how the four and the one may be related. So now you have all these scientists here, right? Like, so everybody's come to this place to try to figure out what's happening. And they're just all talking over each other, all arguing. They're up in this like really enclosed space. Nobody's hearing anybody. They're not going to figure it out, right? They're trying to crack this code, but they cannot. But what do we find with our expert friend? He's outside, and he's throwing the football around with his buddy. And I can't help but think about Albert Einstein with this. And I think the sweater is sort of like an Einstein sweater that this guy is wearing. But also the idea that instead of trying to like figure out a problem, Einstein would go for walks, right? And he would just go for long walks. And that was the way that he found solutions came to him and answers came to him was through walks. So it wasn't trying to like crack the code necessarily. It came to him. It wasn't like his willing necessarily, right? And so I think that's a pretty interesting thing to pay attention to. And so this guy's outside throwing the football around and they're just kind of like having fun, right? They're kind of talking about it, but it's more like speculation and sort of like exploration of the idea as opposed to trying to like figure it out like all those other scientists. And he's talking about the problem, but in sort of like a roundabout way, and he's just kind of like trying to. It's almost like he's gonna figure it out, but not through force. And one of the things he questions is like, well, why is it in quaternary or quaternary or whatever it is? Why would you make it so complex? And he stops, and he has an aha moment here for sure. And so he stops, and what he says is, "It's not quaternary. I think I know what it is." Well, what do we have to look at then? Talked about the 4 and the 1. Well, what is the thing that Einstein was trying to figure out? Unified theory. I still don't know much about this. Like, I'm not a physicist, but I do understand that that's one of his main researches, and one of the goals that he fell short of was trying to understand a unified theory. And I think this is what the scientist or the expert in this show is coming to a realization of, is that this code is something having to do with a unified theory. And so unification always means one. It always means things coming together, all together, everything coming together. And that the unification is the answer. But this is really a fascinating cut here, because what do we see next? Well, we see next the scientists or other scientists working on something, and they're working on some type of, I don't know, virus or some type of sequence. Who knows what it is? But based off of that cut, we can infer that this guy figured out what was going on, and they purposely decided to do this. They purposely decided to create something physical out of this code that is pushing us towards unification, and we're going to implement this. This is not a one-person job. This is a organized effort to create this and to put it out there. And we're going to see that it's put out there, and it's going to have some effects, right? So before, it was about a year and a half on the countdown when they were first seeing the code. Now it's 71 days on the countdown. So that means that we've gone for a year and a quarter, basically. And this is where they're at. So this took some time. This took a lot of process to get this project off of the ground. It wasn't that easy, but it happened, and it's happening. And so this is one of those really good Vince Gilligan scenes where he's showing all aspects of like the process and people going through their routines at jobs that they're good at. And kind of like he's flexing his muscles, I think, here, which he does oftentimes because he can. And he's just kind of like, this is pure enjoyment, I think, for him. But this is why people watch his shows too, is these types of scenes where you're just kind of like, you're in awe, and he's in control, right? You can tell that he's in control. All right. So now we get to start seeing our main character, right? Carol. And so what is Carol doing? Well, Carol is at a book signing because she just created another book. She has a lot of books, a lot of very big books, right? And first thing maybe we'll reference is what do we see in the audience? Well, we see it's all women, right? They're all like middle age, older women. Um, but what are we also seeing like kind of like hidden a little bit? One woman has a purple shirt on with a wheel, and I would not be surprised if that's the wheel of Dharma, which, in Buddhism, they would say that you have to ride the wheel of Dharma to find liberation or to find your next incarnation, perhaps. And then on the other side, we have another um, lady who's wearing some serpents on her neck. And I think there is definitely some biblical significance to serpents and what they're supposed to represent. A serpent is often associated with death and rebirth and the sloughing of the skin, especially with the Ouroboros. I think one of the things we're noticing with these fans is they are very devout, right? They love this writer, who they don't know, obviously, but they love her and they love her stories. And they're sort of like a cult in a way. They're obsessed, right? Like I think that's one of the things you'll see in these scenes is like these people are obsessed with this person, and they're obsessed with these stories. And so, what is this obsession leading to with some of these people is that their life is about these books. Their life is centered around these stories, and all I can think about is how sad that is, and how sort of pathetic these people are because they that's all they care about. And they have no life outside of this. One of the first ladies who comes up to have her book signed is talking about what would happen if Raban was not alive. It's like, well, this is a fictional character. It doesn't matter if he's dead or not. But for these people, it is like a life or death. And so it kind of tells you about these fans, but it also tells you about who she's selling to and who she's working for. And I think we'll find some things about Carol soon that show that she doesn't respect this at all, and she doesn't respect these people because she sees what's going on. Um, what I think we will definitely find as we talk more about it that Carol sees reality very clearly, and that's one of her problems. That was one of her main problems in life is how clearly she sees reality, and she sees how pathetic these people are. But she's selling to them, right? Because she's making money and she's getting paid and she has fame and everything that she could have asked for, right? All the materials that she could ever ask for are hers. So one of the things we're seeing here in this scene is how Carol is completely living within her persona. And so what is a persona but uh, a curated personality to show to the external world? And why do we know that this is her persona? Well, partially because it's so impersonal. And one of the things that she's doing is she's just focused on keeping things as they are and continuing her success. And so how do you do that? Well, you lie to people and you live through that persona. And so what do we see in her messages? Every message is keep the winds at your back. She just says that to everybody. And she's just kind of like she's almost like seeing people like they're just objects and they're objects for her benefit. And nobody is different from anybody. They're all the same. And I think that's just somebody who's living within that persona or like their ego, basically. You see this a lot with people today where everything is focused on their ego and focus on that personality that they've built up, and they're using it to succeed and go higher and make more money and uh, be more successful. But we're kind of seeing what that leads to a little bit here. And then you have this pirate guy who comes, and he's great, right? This guy knows all the details. He knows everything about these books, and a little too much, right? And he's like laying down his sword, and he's talking about the mythology of everything. And Carol and Helen are kind of like a little caught off guard. They don't know what to do with this guy. Like most of the people there are pretty tame. This guy is a little, he's like on one, right? And I think this is an example of that extreme fanaticism that happens when people don't have a real life and they're living some pretend life. And this guy is definitely living a pretend life in which everything is focused around these books. This is the same thing you see in sports. You know, people become huge fanatics and they abandon like any semblance of reality and focus everything around the year of football or whatever it is, and that becomes who they are. Everything is about the book or about the sport, and that's just like it's a pretty sad way to live, I would say. And you see how Carol's reacting. She doesn't really want a part of this guy for the most part. So after the book signing, we see Carol and Helen get in the car together in a town car, and I think it's probably a deliberate choice to dress them as they're dressed, where Carol is in black and Helen is in white, and we'll see this again in the second episode, at least, where Carol is also wearing dark colors in contrast to another character. And I think it's an early indicator of kind of where Carol lands on the side of, I don't know. I don't know if it's a good or evil consideration necessarily, but there are definitely two sides to a whole. I think when we look into this relationship, as we'll talk about right now, we're going to find that Carol is more of the downer and Helen is more of the upper. And maybe that's actually part of their relationship dynamic, is that Helen has to balance out Carol and she has to give the positivity or like the good spin on things, because otherwise Carol would kind of descend into darkness, which I do think we'll see soon. And so then we get a really helpful quote from Carol where she says, "Are you a fan of mindless crap?" And Helen kind of gives her a stare. And so we see this is Carol's true self now, right? It's not good, but that's what she really believes, is like, this is shit. And this is my life, right? I'm producing shit. And she hates it. And Helen is like, oh, man, am I ever gonna get her to think differently? Probably not. One of the things to keep in mind with this relationship, which we're not going to see much of, obviously, we might see more flashbacks. I think we see another flashback from them in episode 3. It looks like, but they have a dual relationship because they're together romantically, but Helen is also Carol's manager. And I don't think that's a mistake or a coincidence that she's her manager, in that she's managing her books and her career, but I also think that she's managing Carol's life. And I do believe that when you look at this relationship pretty closely, you'll see that this is a textbook codependent relationship between the two of them. So this is where the psychological aspects come in, right? And Helen is in this codependent relationship. Helen is responsible for making or keeping Carol happy. That's her job. But is that really helping Carol? I don't think it is. And I think that's one of the primary themes that's going to come up in this show, is that Carol's not happy in this relationship. She's not happy with her life. And maybe the way that her relationship is with her partner, and maybe with like other aspects of life, including possibly her parents in the past, have contributed to her unhappiness. And that maybe the only way that she can find happiness is by cutting herself off from some of this codependency. Because the person wants to keep her happy, but she's not happy. And that's something that only a person can find within, I would say. So then we go back to sort of like the science team, I guess you could call them. And we got two scientists who are coming in to work. And they don't say what time they're coming in, but they're coming in late/early. right? um, they can't distinguish between what is late and what is early. So that's kind of telling us that this is more than likely like 2 or 3 in the morning, right? It was like middle of the night. Nobody's doing much at that time. I don't know how many people go out at that time. That's the dead. That's the dead of night, right? There's not a lot of reasons to be doing anything at that point. But they're there, right? They were called there to come in and take care of something, right? And they talk to the security guard and they say, "We got nothing. We are not onto anything." Um, I don't think that's true. I think that these people are just completely in the dark, and that these are sort of like poor schlups, right? They're just kind of like being thrown out there as maybe like sacrificial lambs in a way, because I think we have to ask ourselves, why are they there at that time? They say that they're there to gas some rats. Well, that couldn't have waited. Why do they have them doing that in the middle of the night? Why they don't know why they're there. They're kind of like, this is ridiculous, but they're doing it, right? Like that's their marching orders. But it seems like there's a reason that they're there at that time, and maybe that this was planned or orchestrated in some way. We have to think back to the beginning of the episode and this idea of the unified theory or unification, and maybe that the scientist, the expert, knew that this was going to happen, and that this is all happening according to plan. These people don't know it, but this is part of the plan. This is part of the plan, is for what is about to happen, which is the scientist is going to get bit, and she's going to be the first one to have the whatever this virus is, and that's how it's going to start spreading. And it's going to spread very fast and very rapidly and exponentially. But again, this doesn't seem like a mistake. It seems like they were they were called there for a reason at that time and that place. And there's something else going on here. So after the scientist gets bit, we see the security guard going to the vending machine, and he's trying to get the Fritos. I don't think it's also a mistake that there's the Lay's Classic next to it, because this is a classic thing that happens to this guy where the chips get stuck. Like, you knew that was going to happen when you're watching it, right? You knew that the he was gonna it was gonna get stuck and he was gonna shake the machine. That's a classic, just like thing that happens to people. Um, so a little kind of like joke there, I think, by the showrunners. And then we see the first transmission, and what do we see is a the person who's been infected kissing the security guard. And so this is very contrary to what we would expect. We would expect a person who becomes infected or to have a virus to then kill somebody, right? Like that's the classic zombie movie trope. That's not what happens. They kiss them. It's the opposite of killing. It's a signifier of love in some way. I think most people would associate kissing with love, and that an affection and maybe even care, right? And so I think that's important to recognize, in that that's how the virus began to be transmitted, and what is continuing to be transmitted is through an act of, not an act of hate, but an act of love. And then we see the other scientist kiss the janitor, and same thing. He's jumping around like he's in bliss, right? Like he's really enjoying himself. And he kisses the janitor, and then slowly we start to get this group of people who have been infected, and they start to create ways to send the virus out. Um, it's interesting who's in this scene together. You have nurses, but you also have police officers. You have, I think, a pizza delivery man. These are people that are not usually in the same room together. These are people that are usually not working together necessarily. And so that seems like maybe it's a good thing, right? That we're having people who are working together that usually might not even ever want to talk to each other, perhaps. I don't know. Or only talk for um, their own selfish reasons, perhaps. So then we see Carol and Helen land in the Albuquerque airport. Shout out to Albuquerque. Love that airport. Very unique place, I would say, and a good filming location. But they go by a little bookshop, and there's this unspoken thing between them where Carol's basically like, you know what to do. And Helen doesn't really want to, but she does. And so I think this is also a telling sign of some of that codependency that they have, where what happens in codependency often is people enabling each other. And so we see how Helen is enabling Carol. She's enabling some of these like bad behaviors that she has. And here, the bad behavior is we're going to take the books that are on the top shelf and put them on the bottom so that we can put our own book up there to try to boost our sales. And so you see how important the sales and kind of like being on the top or being at the pinnacle of things, how important this is for Carol. It's almost like that's what's getting her off a little bit. But Helen is a big part of this. She's contributing to it, and she knows that like this is not good. Maybe Helen has a more respect in terms of sales and like the I don't know what it means to do this job, but she goes along with it. And then we see them coming down the escalator, and what are they doing? They both get a stick of gum. Why are they getting a stick of gum? Well, we soon find out that they were drinking, right? And so alcohol seems to be a big issue in their relationship, and maybe a bigger issue for Carol than Helen, but it's a problem. And so they're using the gum to try to cover up the smell of alcohol, perhaps. But when they get to the car, Carol's the one who tries to drive, and Helen's like, you're not driving. What are you talking about? And she said, I only had one, right? But it's like, nope. And so I think we get a pretty clear indication there that Carol has a drinking problem. And we're going to see that progress in the series, I would say. And maybe it's a much bigger problem for Carol than Helen. And so, what do they have in the car but a breathalyzer? And so, these are breathalyzers that will not allow the car to start unless you pass the breathalyzer. Those are usually court mandated. I don't know if that is the case here, but it's basically like that's the only way we can drive now is if we pass the breathalyzer test. And so, it shows how much Carol and Helen possibly cannot control their use of alcohol, and maybe it's caused some issues in the past. Maybe it's led to some bad things. We don't know. Maybe we'll find that out in future episodes. And so then what do we do next? We're going to the bar, and they're both getting a drink. I think it's important to note that Helen gets a diet soda. And so this is maybe indicating that she's trying to refrain, or she's sober, or I don't know what it is. Meanwhile, Carol gets a Manhattan, and I don't know if anybody's had a Manhattan before, but that's a pretty big Manhattan. um, that's not a regular size Manhattan. That's like a double or a triple Manhattan, and she kind of just like sinks into it a little bit. So you can see that's her happy place or her comfort place. That's what she needs. So another indication of her sort of like alcoholism. So Carol and Helen start talking, and Carol's trying to convince Helen to get a drink. And she's like, you need a drink. Like, how can you not want a drink? And Helen's like, no, I don't. Carol's like, yeah, you do. Another part of this codependent relationship, this is what happens in these relations is people feed off of each other, and they often do things to try to like please or keep the other person happy. And you can see that like maybe this is a trend in their relationship in the past, at least, where maybe Carol has influenced Helen in negative ways to drink more than she would. And maybe that's one of the ways that they relate or that they sort of get along, or like how they know each other, basically. That could have been how their relationship formed. And so this is going to be very off putting to Carol, obviously, because she doesn't have her drinking buddy anymore. that's a problem for her. And Carol says, I don't clink glasses with fucking Diet Pepsi. And so you can see sort of like the aggression she has towards Helen trying to maybe like do the right thing for herself and not drink. And it's like fuck you because you're not doing what I want you to do, and you're not kind of like joining in with me on things, which I think is another part of that those types of relationships that cause a lot of problems for people because they end up giving in eventually. They can't like be opposed to the other person in the relationship at all. They have to be on the same side all the time. And they start talking about Carol's book, and you kind of see more of the hate and like how much she just detests the stories that she's creating. Like she just does not care for them at all. It's almost like sickening to her to talk about it. Her partner can only focus on how much she's selling and like how many people love her. She's focusing on all like those positive things, right? Trying to cheer Carol up. But Carol, again, she sees the reality of it and she knows that she's writing shit and that like this isn't what she's maybe meant to do. Maybe she's meant to do something else, like maybe something more purposeful or meaningful with her life. And she's struggling with that. But Helen can't really see that. All she wants to do is make her feel better. But that doesn't erase the fact that Carol knows something's wrong. So they talk about her uncreated book, the book that hasn't been put out. And the title of it is Bitter Chrysalis. So if we try to understand what chrysalis means, it's uh, having to do with like a cocoon or a metamorphosis about a person changing and for a person like coming to full bloom and maybe like understanding who they really are. But this is the book that she hasn't put out. This is the book that she's holding back on. So I think there's some symbolism and metaphor there in terms of what we're supposed to understand about Carol's story going forward, and that maybe that's the story that she's needing to engage in. One of the things to think about is if you've read or heard any interviews with Vince Gilligan about this show, he's making it very apparent that this is a hero story. I mean, he's like, this is a hero story. This isn't an anti-hero story like Breaking Bad or even Better Call Saul. This is a hero story. And so what is a hero story even about? Well, we're going to get into that in a minute. So Helen mentions here Finnegan's Wake and says, have you ever read Finnegan's Wake? And Carol says no. And Helen's like, I tried to. It's probably a great book. I think this is something that we can easily pass over if we wanted to, but I think this is extremely important detail that's in this rich text that we're breaking down here. And so what is Finnegan's Wake? Well, Finnegan's Wake was a book by um, James Joyce. And so what is Finnegan's Wake about? Well, even before we get to that, what is what is James Joyce most known for? Well, he's known for Finnegan's Wake, but he's also most known for Ulysses. And so Ulysses is another crazy book that I've never read. I would love to, but what I know about it is that it's all about heroes, and it's all about herohood, and there's a lot of mythological, literary, religious characters that are sort of referenced here in this book, including Jesus, Moses, Dante, Don Juan, people like that, right? If you even believe that they're people. And one of the things that Ulysses is sort of a mirror to is the Odyssey, which most people would argue is the greatest mythological story of all time, at least in the Western world. And so when we start thinking about what is mythology about, what is herohood about, what are these stories about? Well, the only place I go in my head at that time is Joseph Campbell, right? So what was Joseph Campbell doing? He was helping us to understand the monomyth. and what the monomyth was, and that there was a central story or myth that existed throughout human history of people becoming heroes in some way. Uh, and how does a person become a hero? Well, they can only become a hero by changing into a hero. And so we have a couple of references there, right? The chrysalis and the metamorphosis and the change that could potentially be coming, and the idea that Carol is a potential hero and that she's on maybe starting to go on the path of herohood. Another thing to keep in mind with the James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake reference is Joseph Campbell was actually one of the people who understood Finnegan's Wake the best, apparently. And he wrote a book called The Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake. I believe that's what it's called. And he talks about this in some of his writings. And like he read Finnegan's Wake and he's like, I know what this is about. This is about mythology, because he studied mythology very deeply. And he was like, people are talking about this book and they have no idea what this book is about. And so he put this text out, The Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake, and that's what got his career started, essentially. That's where he like took off, is because he understood what Finnegan's Wake was about. And he had a pretty good analysis and understanding of it. And so I think that's possibly why we're having the Finnegan's Wake reference as opposed to like Ulysses. I think that might be too on the nose. But the Joseph Campbell connection is there. And anytime you think about heroes in the modern day, or the idea of the hero, it's always going to come back to The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. And Helen makes this statement about, if you make a person happy, that might not be art, but it's something. And so, what is that reference to? Well, it's a reference to what Carol's doing. And it's like, well, you're making people happy, right? That's good. That's enough. Maybe that's all we need to focus on. Well, I mean, I think a big theme of this show is the idea of happiness and what happiness is and how it's achieved. And I think one of the things we're getting from this statement is that all we need to do is try to make people happy. That's all we got to do. We just got to try to like focus on that. That's definitely what's happening in their relationship. They're just trying to keep each other happy. But maybe trying to keep people happy is not the answer. And maybe trying to keep people happy is actually what leads to the opposite of happiness. I think it's also this statement is also indicating that what Carol's doing is not art. She's saying it in sort of like a roundabout way, but she's definitely saying that like this isn't art. You're making people happy, but it's not art. And Carol kind of gives like a half smile, because it's painful to think about that. I think for somebody like her who seems like she has some good ideas and maybe knows that there's more to life, perhaps. But that's all she's doing. She's just trying to make people happy. Um, Maybe we're going to find that that's not enough for Carol. So this is just a really hilarious scene. Like they go out to smoke a cigarette, and apparently neither of them smoke. It doesn't seem like Carol smokes, but they have to smoke together, right? So this is another aspect of that codependent relationship, is they not one of them can do it by themselves, right? Both of them have to be smoking a cigarette for it to be okay. Another way of sort of like keeping each other happy, perhaps. Um, but then at the same time, they're sort of just like bickering at each other the whole time. They're arguing back and forth about just like technicalities, and then they start talking about the comments on the book, and it's just so cynical, right? All they can focus on is, even Helen's doing this at this point, is the misspellings and kind of like the ridiculous things that people are saying. And Carol talks about one of the readers being off of her meds, and so you're just seeing more of how they sort of like hate these people that they're selling these books to, that is just like such a sad thing, that the people that they're making money off of, because like those are the readers. The readers are the people that they make money off. That's how they afford their living. They hate these people. they hate the people that are making money, giving them money, and that are affording their lifestyle. You don't want to be that person. I would say I don't. That's not the type of person you want to be, where you're focused on just yourself basically, and you don't care about the others, even though they're the ones that are you're benefiting from. And then Helen looks up at the sky and she sees the jet planes and how they've kind of like formed this strange pattern in the sky. And so the sky comes into play again here, and what's coming from the sky or coming from above, basically. But I think something to notice here is that Carol is paying attention to this a pattern. She's seeing some type of weird pattern, whereas Helen is like, "Is that weird?" Or I don't know. Like, she doesn't really see it, and so I think this is a big distinction between these two characters, and that something I've referenced already is Carol sees things as they are, and she sees reality a little bit more keenly than others, whereas Helen seems to be somebody who just doesn't pay attention to maybe some details, right? And so that's where a lot of the importance in life lies. A lot of times is in the details, and like understanding those details, and that's what Carol's a little curious about, whereas Helen kind of could take it or leave it, right? We got a wide shot of what I believe to be Old Town Albuquerque. Again, shout out to Albuquerque. Spent a lot of summers there growing up. Beautiful shot location. I've only been there for the most part during the day, but it looks beautiful at night there. They picked a good place to do this, I would say. Then you see Carol walking. You could say that that's just like her walking normally, but definitely looks like somebody who's doing the walk after they've been pulled over by a cop, walking in a straight line. I don't know. Maybe you look at that yourself and see if that rings a bell for you. And then they talk about Raban and who was the inspiration for Raban. And I definitely think there's some commentary and themes here about coming out and what it means to come out, and some of the blockages that prevent a person from revealing that to not only their family but just like the general public. I definitely think that's part of the story for Carol and what she's sort of struggling with here. Um, I think you can also go deeper. I would say that there could be some Jungian depth psychology coming into play here, in that Raban would be looked at as the animus. And so in Jungian psychology, there's the animus and the anima. The anima usually corresponds as the soul counterpart for a male, biological male, whereas the animus is the soul counterpart for a female. And usually it has some opposite characteristics to who you are and what you see yourself as. It sort of encompasses a different part of ourself that needs to be integrated, usually. It looks like Raban is somebody who's very strong, who's very capable, who can take care of himself, who is admired, who is revered. One could say that that's what Carol needs to integrate into her life, and what she might be missing in her life. She might not have many of those characteristics or aspects of who she is. And that the only way for her to develop and to maybe become the hero that we want her to be is by integrating the animus parts of herself and bringing them into who she is. One of the things you'll find in this kind of psychology is that if one is not aware that they have an anima or an animus, those images tend to be projected into the external world. And so Raban might be a projection. You could also say that her relationship with Helen is a part of that projection. I believe that Helen thinks that she's the basis for Raban, and she might be partially, but Helen is also somebody who kind of has those characteristics that Carol doesn't have. She's the strong one. She's the capable one. She's the one who's willing to say what she thinks. Um, that's what they would say is why people get into certain relationships is because they're missing a part of themselves, which is that animus or anima. And so they look for somebody to project that image onto, and they can take that part. They can be that person for them. The problem is that the person is still missing it within themselves. And so you become reliant on the other person to hold up that image and be that person for you. And what we're going to find really quickly right now is, well, what happens when that person goes away? And so you see the car crash and then Helen drop to the ground. And what are we finding? Well, we're finding that Carol is freaking out. She doesn't know what to do. She has no idea what to do because one of the things we could argue is that her person that has held up everything for her in her life perhaps is not there anymore. She's incapacitated. And one of the things we hear her call out is, can anybody help us? Is there anybody that can help? And that's what she's doing for a majority of this scene is like, she's trying to look for somebody to help. Somebody needs to help me. I can't do it by myself. I think that's a pretty strong message that we're getting there in terms of how capable she feels in terms of doing things alone or by herself and what she, I don't know, what she believes she is capable of. I don't think she feels like she's capable of much. And I think we'll continue to see that throughout this series as well. She does manage to get Helen in the truck, which I would applaud her for sure. But she's struggling pretty bad here. She's struggling in terms of just like, what do I do? How do I handle this situation? And again, I think this idea of her being alone is so important. It makes me think about existential topics and existentialism and the idea of being alone in the universe and what that means. And I think this is what she's experiencing here. And that, you know, this is a horror trope for sure in terms of like zombies taking over or like everybody, disappearing. But existentialism and being existentially alone is the real horror for a lot of people. And that's one of the things that most people don't want to deal with or face. And I think what is going to happen with Carol is she is going to start having to face that existential aloneness based off of the situation she finds herself in. So Carol goes to the hospital to try to get some help. And I think an important part here is when she helps prevent the baby from falling on the ground. I think we all know that there is a baby in there and it's probably suffering from the same issue that everybody else is suffering from. But it shows the humanity that's there, right? And even though Carol doesn't know what she's doing and she's completely lost and she's struggling and there's no rhyme or reason to this, she still has that humanity in her, and that seems very important, is that she still knows, I gotta try to stop this baby from falling on the ground. And even when she like accidentally knocks a guy over, she's very sorry about it, right? She doesn't want to be hurting people, which I say that says something about her character. And we get to this scene, which is, I mean, Ray Seahorn's acting is just unbelievable at all times, but she really does a stellar job here in terms of expressing that emotion of what it means to lose somebody. But I think this isn't just about losing somebody, right? And so I think some of what she's, not only through what we know about the character already and their relationship and their codependency, and what we know about Carol and how maybe she's depending on this person and how like this person has a lot of her attributes that she would like to have in herself to make herself more capable. I think that Carol's grief here is of such an intensity based off of the fact that she's not just losing somebody, she's losing a part of herself. And what I mean by that is that this person was everything for Carol. Her whole life was revolving around Helen, and also Helen being that person for her and managing her life, like we said before. And so the emotion and the grief that comes from losing somebody like that is of a greater intensity. And I think anybody who has ever lost a parent that they were very dependent on will understand that it's very different than losing somebody who maybe you weren't reliant on in some way or wasn't like holding your life up. Because what is happening here is Carol is realizing, like, I've lost this person, I've lost a part of myself, and I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm by myself. And that's a pretty terrifying thing, I would say, for many people. And then we have this part where Carol drives away from the hospital, and everybody's like standing up and starting to unify, and she's freaking out because, like, why are all these people doing all the same thing now, and why are they not seizing anymore? And she's driving away from them in complete terror. One of the things we'll notice is that it seems at one point that, you know, people are chasing after her, which is a common horror movie trope, but they're not chasing after her. What are they doing? They're going to try to extinguish fires. So again, these people, like they said, all they're trying to do is help, right? They just want to help. They have benevolent purposes, if you will. But Carol is definitely not seeing that, and this is frightening to her, and she needs to get out of there. And then Carol drives to her house, and I don't know. I don't think this is the same house, but I do think that there's some. They chose this house for a reason in the reference back to Breaking Bad, because I can't help but notice how much this cul-de-sac and this house on the end of a dead end street, sort of like in a hilly area, looks exactly like Hank and Marie's house from Breaking Bad. I think that's just, if they did that, that's pretty cool, and it's something that it's like fan service for sure. But it definitely is reminiscent of it. But that's where Carol goes next. Is I gotta get back home. I think this is another great acting job in that Seahorn is just showing the lack of strength and virility that this person possesses, and that she's basically like a feeble person. Obviously, she just lost somebody, but I think that that's not a reason to cancel out what we're seeing here, and understand like how this helps us understand who the character is and has been. So then we have these young children who come up and want to help Carol. Um, I think one of the things that I'm noticing here is coming up as I've watched a couple episodes of the show is that the people, the unified people, their well-being, obviously, they're well-meaning. I mean, they have good intent. They want to help Carol. Um, that's also what Helen wanted to do. And maybe, I don't know if we'll see this, maybe her parents wanted to do. They wanted to help. They wanted to make sure everything was okay and that she wasn't in danger. But what happens when you do that all the time, and when that's the way that a person is approached, like as a child, perhaps? I think there's a lot of research out there that we're starting to find in terms of permissive parenting styles, which I think is a theme that comes up in this show psychologically, in that permissive parenting often leads people to negative places in life, and basically places in life where they can't do much for themselves because they had no rules or structure or teaching about how to do things, because everything was done for them. And I think there's elements of that coming out in the scene, and that these people are trying to help Helen. Carol. They're trying to assist her because she doesn't know how to do things herself. She can't think for herself. She can't figure out things on her own. And these people are trying to do that for her. But I think what we're going to see is that that's a big problem. This is a really amazing scene, and I think it's situated perfectly in this episode near the end, in that Ellen gets home, or Carol gets home, and first thing she does is turn on the TV, right? And so, how many people would do that in this situation? Is like the world's on fire. Let's turn the TV on. Let's see what the TV is going to say and what people on the television are going to tell us. I think this is directly related back to what I was just talking about, in that people are always looking for someone to tell them what to do and how to respond or how to react to a situation. They're always depending on other people to figure that out for them. And when Carol gets a channel and it's somebody who looks official, like the president, sort of, her reaction is just like, amazing, fuck yeah, right? God bless the United States of America. But I think it's just indicating this way that the character, but a lot of people in society are so reliant on television and people in positions of authority, basically, like politicians or entertainers or whoever it might be, to tell them like what's going on and what's happening and what to do and how to respond. And I think that's just another indicator of the inability to think for oneself or to like figure things out for oneself. But we quickly come to realize that they're not going to tell Carol anything. And that the message on the screen actually says, you call us when you're ready. And so that's not what she wants, because now it's on her, right? Everything's on her. It depends on her to make a choice, to do something, and that they're not going to necessarily do it. That's definitely not the message she wanted to hear. And so I think there's like a really good compare and contrast here in terms of indicating what she's expecting and what she's used to, and then like what happens when that's not the case. And that puts her in a pretty dark place to know that she needs to call them. I mean, there's more reasons to that, right? It's like, well, why is the TV communicating with me? That's pretty freaky. But I think underlying that idea is that she's being put in the driver's seat a little bit. And so first she goes and gets the phone, and we're like, okay, maybe she'll call. But then it's like, oh, I gotta take a quick trip around the couch, and we see the alcohol coming into play again, right? And so that's her coping mechanism. Obviously, that's her way of dealing with things. And so what does she do? She pours some what looks like some pretty good whiskey, nice glass, at least a double shot, maybe a triple shot there, downs that real quick. So that's a nice quick buzz. And then she refills pretty much half the glass. So, like, that must be, once she finishes that, a good 8 or 9 shots total, at least. So she's like, I'm getting drunk. This is the only way I'm dealing with this is to get drunk. There's no other way to do it. Which indicates something about who she is and how she operates. So they put up this message, and they tell Carol pretty explicitly, your life is your own. And so the only thing that brings up for me is the idea of free will and free choice. And this, whatever this thing is, like, it's an alien, it's God, it's some manifestation of a virus. It's telling Carol, your life is your own. You can make your own choices. You can do this however you want to do. You can pick the route. At the same time, they're giving her some guardrails, and they're giving her some directions, like maybe you don't want to do that, maybe you don't want to do that. I do think there's some contradictions that are coming up there in terms of what is the message. What is the message we're sending? Are we telling a person that they have free will and they can do what they want? Or are we trying to like guide them a certain way? I think in the end, they are giving some possible ways of doing things, but they're not going to stop Carol from making choices. And so I think this goes back to a couple of things we've already hit on, is that this is existentialism in that she's alone and she's in a position to make choices on her own and nobody can stop her. And that's in that vein of philosophy, they would say that that's one of the things that people fear the most is free will and choice and doing things of their own accord, and that they will do everything in their power to not let that be the case because they don't know what that's going to lead to. They don't know who they're going to become, perhaps. And then they get into this idea of the code or the signal that's been going out. And they say, we don't know how long it's been going out. It might have been going out for all of human existence. So that's a pretty interesting idea, right? Like that a signal has been going forever, perhaps. It definitely makes me think about like 2001 Space Odyssey and some of the themes that are being explored there in terms of the monolith and like where the monolith came from and how did it even get there and how long has it been there. There's definitely some archetypal or archetypal ideas here of that which predates humans and predates civilization and maybe even predates the existence of matter. And that like maybe there's signals or code or whatever it might be that is non-physical and has been going on for a very long time. And maybe part of what's happening in the show and maybe what they're trying to have us question in terms of the audience is what happens if that code or that signal is received and picked up? What does that lead to potentially? What are the consequences of that? What is that going to do to people or to the world, perhaps? And then we also get the four becoming the one, which we identified and talked about earlier in this video, where we have the four codes or strings, the wavy lines. I don't know the science behind it. All I know is that there's four and that they become one. And that's the axiom of Maria. That's what we were referencing earlier, is that the four turns into the one. I'm not going to say any more about that, but I asked you to consider why that's there. And they say it is kind of like a virus, but it's not really. And his better explanation for it is that it's a psychic glue. And so again, we get these intimations of something that is not material and that it is psychic in nature. This also brings up a lot of things for me in terms of Jungian psychology, in that he believed the psyche or psychic things were the basis of all reality, and that material reality itself was a derivative, if you will, of psychic reality or of the psyche. And he believed everything was psyche, and it all came from there. There's some of that I'm picking up here in terms of this psychic glue that's been produced for all time before humans even existed, and that it's now bringing humans together. It's binding them together psychically. There's a lot of like paranormal psychology you can get into on that side of things, I would say. And then she asks who she's talking to. And this is something that we keep seeing in this show as we go, is people referring to themselves in the third person. This person is, or this person was. And then they kind of like list their name and their job or whatever, right? Well, that's all Carol's been identified with for her life. And up to this point is her name, which is very prominent on her book, and her title or her job, which is author. That's who she is. But you could argue that she is her persona, or she is her ego, if you will. And that all these people who have been psychically glued, they're not their egos because they're referring to themselves in the third person. There's something else besides their ego. So that's something to play around with as well, is that these people are not like Carol anymore, and that they're not identified with their ego, maybe. Maybe that's a good way to put it. One of the things we might understand about the idea of the ego is that an ego is often seen as like a separate entity, almost like an island to itself, and that it's surrounded by in Jungian psychology, a mass of unconsciousness. They're saying something very different. They're saying we're not those egos, and that we are actually all just one. We're all unified. And so the that ego is no longer a island to itself. It's part of a huge constellation, maybe, or a larger mass. And they're all sort of like working together in a way. I think one of the things that I'll probably talk about more in these coming episodes is this idea of psychic projection. And what I mean by that is I do believe that part of this race of people that's been created is partially a projection of Carol's minds or even the minds of the other people who have been left behind. And one of the things that the person says is that he's taken over because he was somebody who was intact and he was wearing a suit. And so why is this a psychic projection? Well, I think that's what Carol wants in a way, unconsciously. She doesn't know it, right? She what she wants in a way is for somebody to be in charge, which she asks, who's in charge? She wants somebody to tell her what to do. And so the thing that's being put on the TV that these this race of people is fully aware of is a person of authority, whoever was the highest authority they could find. And let's just put that person up there. And so there's this way that like these people are giving Carol what she wants, but she doesn't realize it. And maybe what will happen over the show, I don't know, is that's going to shift. And maybe her psychic projections and what the alien race or like this virus race is going to be putting out there is going to be very different than what she's getting right now. Maybe it will be a projection based off of a different version of life that she would like, maybe. So this is also connecting to what we were just talking about in terms of all things psyche. And another way you could say that is all things are in the mind or based off the mind. So we get a conversation about how many other people are there like Carol, and we find out that there's only 11 others. So Carol plus 11 others in the world that are like her. I think in the next episode, we find out that there's actually 13. I definitely think this is a biblical reference. Jesus and the 12 apostles, right? And maybe that's not a mistake that it's 13. But if it is a purposeful point and there's 13, who's Jesus? Well, we gotta believe that that's who Carol is, or she's going to be in some way, shape, or form. And so that's an interesting idea to consider as we continue to move on. And he wants they want Carol to join them. That's their goal now, is they want Carol and the others to join. And for her, that's the worst thing. She doesn't want that at all. And she falls to the couch and is completely paralyzed by this idea that she's going to become like them. Carol's only thought right now is, no, I'm not going to do that. And what happens if I say no? And they sort of like try to talk around it. And she's like, well, I thought my life was my own. I thought I was supposed to be able to make choices here. I think this is going to be like a central point of tension in this show, and what we're going to be exploring throughout is the free will and what that means. And is free will possibly connected to this idea of a source or a code or something that we're trying to get connected to? And maybe that is free will. Who knows? And so then this show ends on a great note where Carol's balled up She's curled up like in the fetal position, just trying to protect herself from whatever this is that's happening. She doesn't want any part of it. And they call her house, and she gets a reminder of Helen, who's passed. So that's going to be putting her in a bad place because it's helping her to further realize that this person isn't there anymore. And the guy gets on the phone and they say, "All we want to help. We didn't mean to make you upset." And all she says, "Shut up, shut up, shut up," hangs the phone up, you know? And she's upset, right? But I think that they're trying to help. They want to do the right thing, but they don't know how to. And maybe that's part of Carol's choice is how does she allow these people to help her in the right way, perhaps? How does she inform them about how to help? I don't think she's done that for most of her life. I think it's been sort of like a one-way street in which she's allowed other people to take the reins for her. And maybe what she needs to do is let them know what is helpful and what is not, and to kind of like make that point. And again, I think this might be a theme that comes up a lot during this show. Okay, so that's it for Pluribus Season 1, Episode 1, We As Us. I look forward to doing more of these. I'm going to try to do one for each episode, hopefully in the same amount of depth uh, and specificity. And I hope that you enjoy. Thanks.